I woke at 6:12 in the morning to the sound of metal prying at the lock of the apartment I bled to buy. Through the peephole, my mother held a crowbar. My sister clutched a box of documents. My father stood behind them, certain this door would yield. The real shock wasn't the crowbar, it was their calculated punctuality, a hostile takeover before dawn. I didn't know yet that this was a heist wrapped in the word family. My name is Alina Price. It was just past 6 in the morning when the pounding began. It was not the hesitant knock of a neighbor checking in. It was not the polite rapping of a delivery driver. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of an execution order. Someone was standing outside my front door, and they had come with a calculated purpose. I rolled out of my bed. The hardwood floor felt freezing against my bare feet. I did not turn on the overhead lights. Shadows were my only immediate advantage. I walked silently across the living room to the entryway. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my mind was already shifting gears, locking into a cold, clinical mode. I was a title resolution risk analyst. Panic was an amateur's reaction. Information was the only currency that mattered when a crisis hit. The heavy pounding stopped. A second later, a sharp, grinding noise replaced it. It was the distinct sound of heavy metal scraping against the brass lock housing. Someone was trying to pry the lock away from the door frame. I leaned forward and pressed my eye against the cold glass of the peephole. The fisheye lens distorted the hallway, bending the straight lines of the walls, but the faces staring back at my door were entirely unmistakable. My mother, Valerie Price, stood front and center. Her jaw was set hard, the muscles tight with grim determination. In her right hand, she gripped a solid steel crowbar. She held the heavy tool not like a weapon of desperation, but like an instrument she felt absolutely entitled to use on my property. To her left stood my sister, Sloane Price. Sloane was dressed in her signature effortless aesthetic, looking completely out of place for a home invasion. Her arms were heavily burdened. She clutched a large cardboard box overflowing with thick file folders, loose documents, and a bright roll of orange moving labels. Lurking behind the two of them, half hidden in the artificial fluorescent light of the corridor, was my father. Grant Price hovered like a shadow waiting for a safe moment to strike. In his hand, he tightly clutched a thick manila envelope and a small, rectangular piece of white plastic. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I recognized that specific piece of plastic instantly. It was a secure access keycard. It was the exact model issued strictly to verified residents of this building. My father had a cloned keycard. They had not simply walked in behind a careless delivery person. They had systematically breached the building's digital security perimeter. "Open the door!" Sloane yelled. Her voice was muffled by the thick wood, but the shrill, demanding pitch of her entitlement sliced right through the barrier. "This is the family apartment. I am just here to take back what belongs to me." Family apartment. The two words tasted like battery acid in my mouth. I had bled for this place. I had worked 80-hour weeks for years. I had scrutinized disaster claim files until my vision blurred and my head pounded. I had saved every single penny to buy this loft in the renovated warehouse district. And now, my sister stood in the hallway, declaring my home community property simply because she had failed at her own life. "Alina, I know you are in there," my mother commanded. Her voice did not hold a single shred of maternal warmth. It was the voice of a warden demanding compliance. "If you do not open this door right now, we will break it down." "You are being completely ridiculous." I did not speak. I reached up and ensured the heavy steel security chain was firmly seated in its metal track. Then, I reached down and turned the deadbolt. The loud, metallic click echoed loudly out into the hallway. The three of them paused. They thought I was surrendering. I turned the brass handle and pulled the door open exactly 3 inches. Masas. The heavy steel chain snapped taut, holding the solid wooden door firmly in place. A vertical sliver of the hallway revealed them. 3 predators expecting to find a sheep. They expected a tearful, confused 34-year-old woman. They expected a daughter who would immediately crumble under the crushing weight of family guilt and sudden intimidation. Instead, They saw my face framed in the narrow gap. My expression was entirely dead. My eyes were completely hollow and locked onto theirs. I did not flinch. I did not step back into my apartment. I stood like a stone wall. The three of them froze in place. The sudden silence that fell over the hallway was infinitely heavier than the pounding had been. My mother lowered the steel crowbar by a fraction of an inch. Sloane's mouth opened slightly, her rehearsed speech dying quietly in her throat. My father was the first to recover his nerve. He stepped forward, pushing past my mother's shoulder. He raised the manila envelope and the cloned white keycard up to the gap in the door. He tried to arrange his facial features into an expression of calm, rational authority. He wanted to frame this aggressive home invasion as a simple, civil handover of property. "Alina, let us be reasonable," Grant said. His voice was smooth and heavily practiced. "We have the right of residency. We have the documents for the return of investment right here. We are just here to finalize the transition. Do not make this harder than it has to be." I stared directly at the keycard in his hand. My mind worked with surgical precision, analyzing the threat. To get a cloned card, they needed an original card. To get an original, they needed to have intercepted a welcome packet, or bribed a staff member, or forged a secondary authorization form. They had been planning this strike for weeks. They had mapped out my defenses. "The moving truck is parked right downstairs," Sloane sneered. Stepping up quickly beside my father, she puffed out her chest, trying to project dominance. She spoke as if victory was already a foregone conclusion. She spoke as if her velvet sofa and overpriced decorative pillows would be sitting comfortably in my living room in a matter of minutes. "The movers are charging by the hour. Open the door, Alina. You are embarrassing yourself." "You have 10 seconds to leave," I said. My voice was dangerously quiet. It was the exact, emotionless tone I used when catching a fraudulent claim file at work. "Before I call the police—" "You will not call the police on your own family," Valerie snapped, raising the heavy crowbar again. The metal glinted harshly under the hallway lights. "I will pry this door right off its hinges if I have to." She stepped aggressively forward, wedging the flattened end of the crowbar toward the narrow gap in the doorframe. Before the cold steel could make contact with the wood, a quiet click echoed down the hall. 4 doors down, a brass lock turned. The heavy door cracked open. A sliver of darkness appeared, and then the unmistakable square of a smartphone camera lens poked out into the light. A neighbor. They were recording everything. At that exact second, the building's hallway security alarm tripped. A piercing, high-pitched siren shattered the morning quiet. A strobe light at the far end of the corridor began flashing a blinding red warning. The building management system had been alerted to the tampered entrance and the escalating noise. The Price family flinched violently, reacting as if they had been struck by lightning. Valerie dropped the crowbar to her side, her face flushing with sudden, frantic rage. Sloane let out a sharp gasp, hugging the cardboard box tight against her chest, her eyes darting wildly toward the glowing red light. Grant shoved the legal documents and the cloned keycard deep back into his jacket pocket. Stepping backward instantly, they were furious. They were entirely ready to tear me apart. But they were ultimate cowards in the face of public exposure. The recording camera lens and the blaring siren instantly stripped away their artificial power. Their grand, aggressive takeover had been aborted before it could fully detonate. "This is not over, Alina," my mother hissed. Her eyes were venomous, burning with a promise of retribution. "You owe us—" "Let us go," my father muttered, grabbing my mother by the arm. "The police will be here in 2 minutes." They turned and fled quickly toward the emergency stairwell. Sloane struggled under the awkward weight of her moving boxes, her expensive heels clicking frantically against the polished concrete floor. I watched them through the narrow gap until the heavy fire door slammed shut behind them. I closed my door. I slid the primary deadbolt home. I locked the secondary deadbolt. I checked the steel chain one final time. The silence of my apartment wrapped tightly around me. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. The adrenaline surging through my veins was pure, cold, and electric. My phone vibrated violently on the kitchen counter. I walked over and picked it up. The bright screen lit up with an urgent text message from the building manager. The message read that someone had submitted an emergency residency authorization request for my unit at exactly 5:41 this morning. I needed to contact the management office immediately. I stared at the glowing screen. 5:41. They had not just shown up to intimidate me into handing over the keys. They had filed the official paperwork before the sun even came up. They wanted the building system to legally recognize them as residents before they broke my lock. It was a perfectly timed, legally orchestrated siege. I set the phone down on the cold granite counter. I took a deep, steadying breath. They wanted a brutal war over documents and legal technicalities. They had absolutely no idea they had just declared war on a professional risk analyst. 4 months ago, the world was quiet. I had just returned to Pittsburgh after 18 months of living entirely out of suitcases. For a year and a half, my reality had consisted of rental cars, cheap motel coffee, and disaster zones. My job at Halcyon Title Resolution required me to parachute into the chaotic aftermath of hurricanes, wildfires, and floods. I spent my days sifting through mountains of ruined property records, untangling complex ownership disputes, and rooting out post-disaster title fraud. I was deeply, fundamentally exhausted. My bones ached with the kind of fatigue that sleep could no longer cure. I craved roots. I craved a heavy door that locked behind me, a space that belonged to absolutely no one else. That was when I found the loft. It was a sprawling, open space in a renovated warehouse down by the riverfront. It had exposed red brick walls, massive industrial windows that let the morning light flood in, and heavy timber beams holding up the high ceilings. I poured every single dollar of my hazard pay, my field deployment bonuses, and my accumulated savings into the down payment. It was the first time in my life I had acquired enough capital to secure something permanent. When I announced the purchase to my family, they reacted with a sudden, overwhelming warmth that should have been my absolute first warning. I had spent my entire adult life as the independent, slightly detached daughter, purposefully keeping a safe distance from the endless cycle of financial and emotional crises that defined the Price household. I was the reliable background character, but suddenly, upon signing the deed, I became the center of their universe. My mother, Valerie, insisted on hosting a massive welcome home and congratulations dinner. The dining room table groaned under the weight of a heavy pot roast, roasted root vegetables, and 3 expensive bottles of wine. The atmosphere in the house was thick with a cloying, performative affection that made my skin prickle. My father, Grant, sat at the head of the table, suddenly fascinated by the mundane, bureaucratic details of real estate transactions. He poured me a large glass of red wine and casually interrogated me about the closing process. He asked about the escrow timeline, the specific title insurance agency I used, and the exact spelling of my legal name on the final recorded deed. At the time, I brushed it off as a father taking an awkward, belated interest in his daughter's career field. Across the table, my sister Sloane swirled her wine and offered a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She leaned back in her upholstered chair and joked that it was about time someone in the house bought something actually worth living in. She laughed, but the sound was sharp and brittle, carrying an undercurrent of raw envy. I knew exactly why. Sloane was currently drowning in a sea of hidden debt. For 2 years, she had tried desperately to build a luxury lifestyle content brand on social media. She had leased expensive cars, rented designer clothes, and booked lavish trips she could never actually afford, all to project a flawless image of effortless wealth to strangers on the internet. The brand had completely imploded just weeks before I returned to Pittsburgh. Her credit cards were maxed out, her sponsors had dropped her, and her meticulously curated digital life was crumbling into pieces. Yet, instead of panicking, she spent the entire evening talking vaguely about how a brand new space with the right industrial aesthetic would be the perfect catalyst for her grand professional comeback. I was too tired to read between the lines. I wanted so desperately to believe that we had outgrown our old dysfunctions. I wanted to believe that age had mellowed my parents and humbled my sister. I forced myself to accept their sudden interest as genuine familial love. It is an incredibly dangerous thing, letting your guard down just because you are too exhausted to hold the shield up anymore. They moved in on my fatigue with quiet, surgical precision. After dinner, while we cleared the porcelain plates, Valerie put a warm, comforting hand on my shoulder. She told me I looked absolutely dead on my feet. She offered to take my closing documents, my insurance binders, and my appliance warranty paperwork to organize them into a neat filing system at her house. She said I was far too busy and far too drained from moving to deal with tedious administrative chores. Shortly after, Grant casually asked if I could print him a copy of the loft floor plan. He claimed he wanted to review the layout to check the fire egress routes and evaluate the structural integrity of the window locks. He played the role of the protective, handy father to absolute perfection. I agreed to send him a digital copy, feeling a brief, foolish flicker of gratitude for his concern. The true nature of their celebration revealed itself when dessert was served. Valerie stood up at the head of the table, gently clinking her silver dessert fork against her crystal wine glass to command the room's attention. Her eyes were bright, and her smile was unnervingly wide. She raised her glass high and declared that this new property was a beautiful opportunity for the whole family to start over. She toasted to fresh starts, shared resources, and new horizons. As she spoke those words, a strange, silent choreography unfolded. Both Valerie and Grant subtly shifted their gaze away from me and looked directly at Sloane. It was an instinctual, microscopic movement, but in that split second, the air in the dining room shifted heavily. They looked at my sister as if the exposed brick and the high timber ceilings already belonged to her. They looked at her as if my new address was nothing more than the pre-purchased stage set for her highly anticipated redemption arc. A cold knot tightened instantly in my stomach. The exhaustion momentarily cleared from my mind, replaced by a sharp spike of defensive clarity. I set my glass down on the table. The heavy base hit the wood a little too hard. I looked my mother directly in the eye and corrected her. I stated, very clearly and deliberately, that I loved them, but this apartment was strictly mine. It was my money, my name on the 30-year mortgage, and my personal sanctuary. I said it was not a family project, and it was not a shared asset. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, the gaslighting began. Valerie let out a high, dismissive laugh, waving her hand in the air as if swatting away a pesky fly. She told me I was being overly dramatic and sensitive. Grant chuckled, shaking his head, and told me to stop being so defensive and selfish about my success. They completely bulldozed over my boundary, smoothly framing my clear statement of ownership as the paranoid rambling of an overtired, ungrateful woman. They exchanged knowing, sympathetic looks with each other, silently agreeing that I was simply having a stressful week and did not actually mean what I said. I left the dinner feeling like the solid ground beneath my feet had been quietly removed and replaced with quicksand. That night, I drove back to my new loft. The vast, empty space felt less like a sanctuary and more like a fortress waiting to be breached. I sat down on the cold hardwood floor in the center of the living room, surrounded by unpacked brown cardboard boxes. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out the thick manila welcome kit provided by the building management team earlier that afternoon. The front of the heavy envelope was sealed with a thick adhesive flap. I slid my index finger under the flap to tear it open, but the paper gave way far too easily. The adhesive was weak, slightly warped, and lacked the satisfying rip of a fresh seal. It looked exactly like the tampered envelopes I inspected in fraud cases, as if it had been exposed to steam, opened, and carefully pressed back down. Frowning, I dumped the contents onto the floor. Out slid the building rulebook, the fitness center waiver form, the parking garage remote, and a small translucent plastic bag meant to hold the physical backup keys to my front door. According to the printed inventory list stapled to the inside of the manila envelope, the small bag was supposed to contain 2 standard brass keys. I picked up the small plastic bag and held it up to the harsh light of the bare overhead bulb. There was only one key inside. I sat alone in the quiet expanse of my new home, staring at the single piece of jagged brass. The memory of my father asking for the floor plan and my mother offering to manage my paperwork suddenly felt less like familial care and more like a tactical reconnaissance mission. They had not just arrived to knock on my door this morning. They had already been standing quietly inside my life for months, meticulously mapping the layout of their theft. I did not call them out immediately. In my line of work, confronting a fraudster before you have the entire paper trail is a rookie mistake. You do not show your hand until you hold all the cards. The very next morning, less than 24 hours after the welcome dinner, I hired an independent commercial locksmith. I paid him $350 out of my own pocket to remove the standard brass deadbolt and install a heavy-duty smart lock with a randomized numeric keypad. I did not text my parents to complain about the missing spare key. I played the role of the busy, oblivious daughter, quietly fortifying my walls while I waited to see what their next move would be. I did not have to wait long. 3 days later, the psychological warfare began in the digital space. I was at my desk at Halcyon Title, deep into a complex commercial property claim. When my phone vibrated, it was a social media notification. Sloan had posted a photograph. In the image, she was standing on the cobblestone sidewalk directly beneath my specific corner of the warehouse building. She wore a perfectly tailored blazer and held an artisan coffee cup, projecting the flawless image of a successful entrepreneur. It was the caption that made my stomach drop, feeling so incredibly blessed today. My amazing sister and I are teaming up to help me start over downtown. Huge things are coming for the new studio space. Watch this journey. She had tagged the exact neighborhood and pinned the location precisely to my building. She did not outright claim she owned the property, but she deliberately weaponized the ambiguity. She crafted a public narrative that we were partners, that this was a joint venture, a beautiful family triumph. Within 2 hours, the social pressure campaign hit me like a tidal wave. My inbox and messaging apps overflowed. Aunt Martha sent a long text message, praising me for finally stepping up and taking my sister in during her terrible financial hardships. An old college roommate messaged me, saying she loved seeing siblings buy real estate together. Then came the voicemails from the women in my mother's church congregation. Their voices dripped with that highly specific, passive-aggressive sweetness. They told me how Christian it was of me to share my blessings, how a good sister always provides a solid safety net. The trap was brilliantly designed. If I went online and publicly corrected Sloan, telling everyone she was a liar and had absolutely no right to my home, I would instantly become the villain. I would be the cold, selfish, corporate sister publicly humiliating a woman who was already down on her luck. The gaslighting had expanded far beyond the dining room table. They had successfully conscripted my entire social circle into enforcing their delusion. The following Tuesday, the attack shifted from social manipulation to documented legal encroachment. I retrieved my mail from the lobby lockbox. Nestled between a credit card offer and a grocery flyer was a crisp, heavy envelope bearing the building management's official logo. I tore it open in the elevator. It was a formal welcome letter. Dear resident, we are writing to thank you for promptly submitting the secondary occupant registration form. We have processed the background check and look forward to welcoming Sloan Price to the community on the 14th of this month. The 14th, that was exactly 1 week away. I marched straight into the management office on the ground floor. I demanded to see the physical registration file. Kevin, the assistant property manager, looked confused but slid a photocopied packet across his wooden desk. I stared at the pages, my vision narrowing to a pinpoint. There was my signature at the bottom of the authorization page. It was a decent forgery, mimicking the sharp angles of my handwriting, but the pressure of the pen was all wrong. But the forged signature was not the most horrifying part of the document. At the very bottom of the second page, stamped perfectly in dark blue ink, was an official state notary seal. It carried a registration number, an expiration date, and a name, Grant Price, Notary Public, my own father. He had used his state-issued legal authority to notarize a fraudulent contract against me. He had weaponized his professional credentials to legitimize a document I had never seen, granting my sister formal documented tenancy in my home. He was laying down a concrete legal foundation to bypass my consent entirely. I walked out of the office and immediately dialed my mother. My voice was dangerously low, vibrating with a cold fury I could barely contain. I asked her point blank what they were doing. Valerie answered with a tone of mild, patronizing exasperation. It was the exact voice one might use to soothe a toddler throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. "Oh, Alina, please stop making a mountain out of a molehill. It is just a simple paperwork shortcut." I told her forgery was a felony, not a shortcut. She scoffed, a sharp, dismissive sound over the phone speaker. Sloan just needed a prestigious address to secure some new vendor contracts for her brand reboot. Your father simply expedited the administrative side so she would not lose the deals. Why are you being so difficult? Every family is flexible with these little things. You are completely overreacting to a minor misunderstanding. A minor misunderstanding. She was actively rewriting reality while I was forced to live in it. At home, I was the hysterical, ungrateful daughter refusing to help her kin. Out in the world, I was the generous savior they had invented for social media points. I was being suffocated by their conflicting narratives. By Friday afternoon, the physical invasion manifested. I stepped off the elevator on my floor and stopped dead in my tracks. Stacked neatly against the brick wall right beside my front door were 4 large, heavy commercial shipping boxes. I walked closer and read the shipping labels. They were addressed to Sloan Price, utilizing my exact apartment number. The return addresses belonged to high-end textile manufacturers and imported lighting distributors. She was not just sending personal mail here. She was legally establishing my apartment as the commercial headquarters for her business. As a title analyst, I knew exactly what this meant. If she received business inventory here, if her corporate mail arrived here, removing her would eventually require formal eviction proceedings. She was building a paper trail of residency so thick that the local police would eventually declare it a civil matter and refuse to intervene. But the absolute climax of their quiet siege arrived on Monday morning. I was reviewing a complicated property deed at work when my personal email chimed. It was an automated alert from my local utility provider. I logged into my account portal to check the monthly billing statement. My eyes scanned the digital dashboard. The account holder section no longer displayed my name alone. The account type had been formally modified from a single user profile to a joint financial responsibility structure. I grabbed my cell phone and called the utility company. I sat on hold for 42 excruciating minutes. When a customer service representative finally answered, I demanded an explanation for the unauthorized account change. The representative was cheerful and utterly unhelpful. "Yes, ma'am. I see the update right here. We received the digital authorization form to activate the shared billing mode yesterday afternoon. The form was authorized utilizing your verified electronic signature profile. Your sister, Sloan Price, is now an equal authorized co-payer on the account." I hung up the phone and stared blankly at my computer monitor. The office around me faded away into a dull hum. They did not just want a spare key. They did not just want a temporary place for Sloan to crash while she rebuilt her shattered life. By attaching her name to the utility bills through digital identity theft, my family was fundamentally altering the legal structure of my household. They were tethering her financially to the property, creating a documented history of joint fiscal responsibility. They were wrapping their fingers tightly around my life, slowly and methodically choking out my sole ownership, all without ever stepping foot inside my living room. I hung up the phone with the utility company and did not scream. I did not throw my cell phone against the exposed brick wall. I did not call my mother to demand a tearful explanation, nor did I drive over to their house to confront my father. Emotion is a massive liability when you are dealing with systemic, calculated fraud. I closed my eyes, took one long, ragged breath, and forcefully compartmentalized the betrayal. When I opened my eyes a moment later, I was no longer a disappointed daughter or an exhausted sister. I was a senior risk analyst, and a hostile entity was actively attempting to compromise my primary asset. I walked over to the kitchen island and opened my encrypted work laptop. I bypassed the standard desktop and created a new, highly secure master directory on my solid-state drive. I titled it simply Evidence Archive. I began dragging and dropping every single piece of digital documentation I possessed into that folder. I saved the automated utility email as a raw text file. I scanned the forged secondary occupant form I had retrieved from the property manager. I uploaded the high-resolution photographs I had taken of the commercial shipping labels slapped across the heavy boxes currently resting in my hallway. Then, I initiated a forensic deep dive into the digital footprint of my own life. I logged into the resident portal administrative dashboard. Because I was the primary leaseholder and the verified owner, I possessed back-end access to the raw server logs regarding my specific unit. I exported the raw data to a massive spreadsheet and began filtering the columns by timestamp, internet protocol address, and action type. The hidden architecture of their invasion emerged instantly. It was not a chaotic, desperate scramble. It was a highly organized, methodical campaign of intrusion. I found a successful login recorded at 2:14 in the morning on a Tuesday. I traced the internet protocol address. It originated directly from the residential broadband network registered to my parents' suburban house. I found another login at 11:45 at night on a Thursday. During that specific session, the user had downloaded the building's guest access policies, the strict rules for commercial deliveries, and the exact legal specifications required for altering a lease structure. Furthermore, I discovered a hidden mail forwarding rule buried deep in the settings. Someone had programmed the system to automatically intercept and digitally forward any correspondence containing the words title, insurance, or deed to a secondary, anonymous email address. They were systematically studying the architecture of the building's bureaucracy to map out the weakest points in my perimeter. Staring at the glowing screen, a chilling, fragmented memory surfaced from the depths of my intense field deployment days. 18 months ago, right before a massive, chaotic hurricane assessment trip down south, I had sat at my parents' dining room table. I had been exhausted, packing my gear, and stressed about the logistics of being off the grid for weeks. I had signed a highly specific, geographically limited power of attorney document and handed it to Valerie. I had legally granted her the authority to sign for certified mail, interact with the postal service on my behalf, and handle basic, low-level administrative notices while I was standing in disaster zones. It was a standard, heavily restricted document designed purely for logistical convenience. It contained explicit clauses forbidding the creation of new financial liabilities, the alteration of property deeds, the addition of tenants, or the encumbrance of any assets. My family was deliberately stretching an expired, tightly limited authorization document, treating it like a universal skeleton key to pick the locks of my entirely separate adult life. My cell phone vibrated sharply on the granite counter, shattering the heavy silence of the apartment. The caller identification displayed a familiar name, Dahlia Knox. She was a senior title examiner over at Lantern Escrow, a highly respected rival firm located across town. We had crossed paths on a massive multi-state commercial fraud case 3 years prior, bonding over our shared obsession with airtight paperwork. I answered the call. Her voice was hushed, carrying the distinct, echoing tone of someone speaking quietly from an empty, secure conference room. She skipped the pleasantries entirely. She told me she was looking at a digital file that had just crossed her desk for a preliminary review, and my specific parcel number was flagged on it. She said she felt professionally and morally obligated to give me a quiet warning. Someone had recently submitted a formal, exploratory inquiry to Lantern Escrow regarding a correction of ownership interest on my exact property address. I felt the blood drain entirely from my face. I asked her to read the exact, specific language of the inquiry out loud. Dahlia recited the text word for word. The submitter was asking the escrow officers about the legal mechanism required for filing a family contribution reimbursement addendum against the existing property title. The air in my lungs turned to ice. As a title analyst, I knew precisely what that meant. A family contribution reimbursement was a highly specialized, deeply insidious legal maneuver. If a party successfully filed and recorded that document with the county clerk, it would formally acknowledge that external family members had provided substantial capital for the purchase, maintenance, or renovation of the property in question. It was the absolute first, critical step in establishing a formal, equitable interest claim. I finally understood the terrifying scope of their plan. They did not just want to park Sloane in my spare bedroom so she could film aesthetic videos for her failing brand. They were actively testing the legal plumbing of the county record system to see if they could successfully inject their names onto the physical, recorded deed. They were trying to manufacture a retroactive, legally binding financial stake in my home. If they succeeded, they would create a massive cloud on my title. I would never be able to sell the loft, refinance the mortgage, or leverage the equity without their explicit, notarized permission. They were transforming my sole property into a legally disputable family asset. I thanked Dahlia, hung up the phone, and immediately shifted from surveillance to total lockdown mode. I contacted the 3 major national credit bureaus. I initiated a hard, permanent freeze on my Social Security number, instantly blocking any new lines of credit, background checks, or identity verifications. I submitted an urgent, expedited request to the county recorder's office for a comprehensive title activity chain report, demanding an immediate alert for any unrecorded liens, pending addendums, or unauthorized inquiries attached to my specific parcel. I then pulled up the forged property management forms on my screen and overlaid the signature vectors with my own authentic, verified digital signatures. The pressure points were wrong, the stroke velocity was entirely off, and the curve angles of the letters were hesitant. I took high-resolution screenshots of the discrepancies and logged them straight into the evidence directory. Every single lie, every forged stroke of the pen, was a piece of ammunition I was quietly stockpiling. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark, distorted shadows across my hardwood floors. I was just finishing the final security audit on my primary checking account when a new, urgent notification pinged loudly on my laptop screen. It was an automated, high-priority alert from the primary mortgage lender holding the note on my loft. The subject line was written in bold, unforgiving red text. It read that an application had been received for a home equity line of credit. I clicked the secure link. My heart deadened to the initial shock, operating solely on cold adrenaline. Someone had successfully bypassed the initial identity verification filters, likely utilizing my stolen personal data and the heavily manipulated power of attorney document. They had initiated a formal application to borrow a massive sum of money against the equity I had already built in the apartment. But the absolute most devastating detail was buried on page 4 of the application summary, hidden quietly under the disbursement instructions. The intended recipient for the massive cash withdrawal was not a personal checking account. The designated beneficiary was a registered limited liability company. It was the exact, specific corporate entity Sloane had registered for her failed, bankrupt lifestyle brand. They were not just trying to steal the physical space. They were actively attempting to drain the financial lifeblood out of my home to fund her spectacular delusion. I met Dahlia Knox at a dimly lit corner booth in a quiet speakeasy downtown, exactly 3 blocks from the Halcyon title offices. The air inside smelled of bitter orange peel and expensive bourbon. She did not bother with a menu. She slid a thin manila folder across the polished mahogany table. Inside were printed copies of the anomalies she had flagged during her shift at Lantern Escrow. Dahlia took a slow sip of her drink and looked me dead in the eye. She explained that amateurs try to forge one massive document, panic, and inevitably get caught. My family was not playing an amateur game. They were executing a sophisticated, multi-pronged siege. They were aggressively testing multiple structural weaknesses in my legal perimeter. If I successfully blocked one path, they had 2 more alternative routes already in motion. She held up 3 fingers, counting off their attack vectors. Prong 1 was the physical occupation, establishing formal tenancy through forged management forms and the convergence of Sloane's commercial mail to create a legally binding residential footprint. Prong 2 was the social engineering, with Valerie controlling the narrative so completely that our entire community would turn against me if I dared to fight back. Prong 3 was the financial strike, the home equity line of credit designed to bleed the property dry and encumber the title before I even realized the veins had been cut. I opened my work laptop right there in the leather booth. I needed to connect the digital fingerprints immediately. I pulled up the raw header data from the home equity loan application alert I had received earlier in the day. I ran a standard trace on the originating Internet Protocol address. It did not bounce back to my parents' residential suburban house this time. The geographic tag pinned it to a commercial industrial park on the absolute edge of the city limits. It was the exact street address of my father's old automotive repair shop. My mind locked onto a seemingly throwaway comment Grant had made at the welcome dinner months ago. He had loudly bragged to the table about fronting the cash for emergency plumbing and structural renovations before I moved my furniture in. I logged into the county clerk's public access portal and ran a wildcard search of his name against my specific property parcel number. There it was. A preliminary notice of a mechanic's lien had been quietly drafted. The attached scanned invoice claimed tens of thousands of dollars in contracting labor and raw materials. I zoomed in to scrutinize the vendor letterhead on the digital invoice. It belonged to a limited liability company I had never heard of before. The itemized list was a masterpiece of absolute fiction. It claimed $12,000 for reinforced subflooring, $8,000 for upgraded commercial electrical panels, and another $5,000 for custom plumbing reroutes. I ran a quick corporate registry search through the state database. The registered agent for that obscure shell company was Grant. He had not hired any contractors. He had not paid for a single piece of copper wire. He had generated a fraudulent invoice from his own ghost corporation, billing my property for phantom renovations to manufacture a documented financial interest in the loft. Meanwhile, the psychological manipulation was evolving into documented financial fiction. While I was sitting across from Dahlia, my phone buzzed heavily with a forwarded text message from a sympathetic cousin. The message was a massive, dramatic paragraph written by Valerie, circulated to the entire extended family network. In it, my mother explicitly claimed she had generously advanced the entire down payment for my loft straight out of her own retirement savings. She was actively painting my hard-earned financial independence as her own charitable achievement, framing me as an ungrateful, unstable child trying to steal the family nest egg. I felt a cold, calculated rage settle deep into my chest. I did not text my cousin back. Instead, I accessed my secure banking portal and pulled the complete wire transfer history for the real estate closing date. Every single cent of that down payment was forensically traceable. I highlighted the incoming deposits. Half of the capital came directly from my Halcyon Title payroll account, composed entirely of my base salary and hazard pay from field deployments. The other half came from the legal liquidation of a municipal bond I had cashed out 2 months prior to the closing. Staring at the digital record of that specific bond, a strange discrepancy finally caught my attention. I remembered how fiercely Valerie had guarded my physical documents over the years. She had kept that specific certificate locked inside a heavy steel firebox in her bedroom closet. She only surrendered it to me 5 years ago because Halcyon Title required original financial disclosures for my federal security clearance. She had handed it over with a tight, resentful smile, telling me I was casually cashing out her decades of hard work. But as I clicked into the original maturity documents I had requested from the broker, the paperwork told a completely different story. The bond had been purchased decades ago, funded entirely by a private family trust. The sole grantor of that trust was my maternal grandmother. The legal terms explicitly stated the funds were to be dispersed directly to me, and only to me, upon reaching my 30th birthday. Valerie had not saved a single penny of that money. She had simply hidden its true origin from me for my entire adult life, weaponizing my own inheritance by pretending it was a massive financial gift from her own pocket. My grandmother had left me a lifeline to ensure I could escape, and my mother had spent years successfully convincing me it was a heavy leash she held the other end of. I closed the banking tab and opened my social media application. I needed to see exactly how far Sloan had taken the charade. Her business page was a masterclass in aggressive manifestation and consumer fraud. She had posted 3 new video teasers in the last 4 hours. She filmed tight, ambiguous shots of the exposed brick and the high industrial windows, carefully avoiding any wide angles that would reveal my personal furniture. The captions were escalating dangerously. She was no longer just talking about starting over. She was actively mobilizing external capital. She proudly announced a grand opening date for her new premium content studio, tagging high-end local photographers and promising her remaining skeptical investors that this new flagship location would resurrect her brand. But the most damning evidence was in the comment section. I saw replies from local small business owners confirming they had already wired non-refundable deposits of $500 each to secure early access to the studio space. She was running a massive financial scam and utilizing my physical address as the bait. Dahlia leaned across the small table, tapping a perfectly manicured fingernail against the dark wood to pull my focus back to the present moment. She reached into her bag and handed me one last piece of paper. It was a slightly blurry photograph of a commercial receipt, passed to her quietly by a trusted contact who handled logistics for local staging companies. I took the paper and held it up to the dim light of the bar. It was a booked reservation confirmation for a heavy-duty commercial moving truck. The registered client name was Sloan. The final destination address was my loft. I looked down at the exact date the reservation was placed and fully processed by the rental company's billing department. It was booked exactly 14 days before the morning they showed up in my hallway with the steel crowbar. The realization hit me with the precise, staggering force of a physical blow. They had not come to my door that early morning to negotiate an arrangement. They had not come to have a difficult family conversation or to aggressively beg for a temporary favor. The social media posts, the forged notary stamps, the ghost renovation invoices, and the fraudulent loan applications were all part of a synchronized, meticulously planned timeline. They had scheduled the moving truck 2 full weeks in advance. They had marked the exact day and the exact hour they intended to execute the hostile takeover. Every single criminal action was premeditated, calculated, and signed in ink long before my mother ever picked up that steel tool. I folded the commercial receipt in half and placed it carefully into my leather bag. I thanked Dahlia, paid the bar tab, and walked out into the cool, sharp evening air. The lingering panic was completely gone now, replaced entirely by the sterile, absolute clarity of a seasoned professional preparing a final devastating audit. They had built a massive, intricate house of cards directly on my property line, and I was going completely pull the bottom card out. I did not immediately drop the hammer. In the high-stakes world of asset recovery, premature confrontation is a fatal error. If you corner a desperate animal without understanding exactly what it is running from, it will bite right through the bone. I needed to know the exact depth of the abyss my family was falling into. To systematically dismantle their siege, I had to quantify their desperation. I utilized the public county property tax portal during my lunch break. I pulled the assessment and payment history for the 4-bedroom suburban house I grew up in. The screen loaded, populating rows of bright red delinquent notices. My father had not paid the property taxes in 3 years. He was hiding a massive compounding tax lien. Worse, a catastrophic balloon payment on a secondary mortgage he had secretly taken out was due in exactly 45 days. The suburban house was not just underwater. It was actively sinking toward imminent foreclosure. I pivoted my search to the county civil court records. I entered Valerie's name. It took less than 2 minutes to find the judgments. She was drowning under the crushing weight of maxed-out retail credit cards and aggressively finalized medical collection accounts. For years, she had meticulously curated an image of comfortable middle-class stability, attending church luncheons and hosting holiday dinners while quietly suffocating under a mountain of hidden debt. She had always spun a subtle narrative that I was the cold, distant daughter who owed the family my success. Now I understood the architecture of her guilt trips. She was not just protecting my sister. She was grooming me to be the financial savior when their house of cards inevitably collapsed. The pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. The loft was never meant to simply serve as a temporary aesthetic background for Sloane to shoot her social media videos. It was a fully realized escape hatch. It was a lifeboat designed to carry all three of them when the bank finally arrived to padlock their front door. They intended to move in, physically occupy my space, and use the fraudulent home equity line of credit to pay off their suburban debts. They were trying to hollow out my life to construct a shelter for their own failures. Sloane was the immediate catalyst, the desperate vanguard of their invasion. I dug deeper into the digital footprint of her newly announced premium content studio. I bypassed her public posts and found the booking portal she had linked in a hidden business directory. She had formally accepted non-refundable security deposits from two high-profile local commercial clients. The contracts promised full exclusive access to the loft for week-long brand shoots scheduled to begin early next month. She had sold thousands of dollars of air, banking entirely on the assumption that they would have successfully evicted me or broken my will by then. The theoretical threat became physical precisely at 5:15 that evening. I walked out of the heavy glass doors of the Halcyon Title Resolution building and headed toward the employee parking garage. The evening air was crisp and biting. As I approached my sedan, a shadow detached itself from the concrete pillar near my bumper. Grant stepped directly into my path, effectively blocking me from reaching my driver's side door. His face was flushed, the skin around his eyes tight with suppressed panic and rising anger. He did not look like the confident patriarch who had casually asked for my floor plans months ago. He looked like a cornered man running out of time. He did not offer a greeting. He lunged forward, thrusting a thick, crumpled stack of printed invoices into my personal space. His voice was a low, aggressive growl that echoed off the concrete walls of the parking structure. He told me he had put real sweat and heavy labor into my property. He claimed he had spent his own hard-earned cash, making sure the loft was safe and functional. He demanded that I stop being an ungrateful bitch and legally acknowledge his equitable share of the real estate. I stood perfectly still, letting his anger wash over me like a cold wave. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached out and took the crumpled stack of papers from his shaking hand. I flipped through the pages. They were more fabricated mechanic liens and padded hardware store receipts, but right in the middle of the stack, a single, legitimate yellow carbon copy invoice caught my eye. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. It was an invoice from a commercial locksmith supply warehouse. It detailed the purchase of a high-security deadbolt cylinder, the exact model that had been originally installed on my loft door before I changed it. I looked at the printed transaction date at the top right corner of the yellow paper. The purchase was dated 9 days before I had even sat down at the title company to sign the final closing documents. My father had quietly purchased and prepared replacement lock hardware for a property I did not even legally own yet. In his blind rage to prove his financial contribution, he had just handed me the absolute smoking gun. He had unintentionally provided documented, physical proof that his plan to control the access to my home was premeditated long before the ink was ever dry on my deed. I folded the yellow invoice neatly, slid it into my blazer pocket, and handed the rest of the crumpled garbage back to him. I looked him dead in the eye, told him to step away from my vehicle, and pressed the unlock button on my key fob. He was too stunned by my absolute lack of emotional reaction to stop me. I got in, locked the doors, and drove out of the garage, leaving him standing alone in the dim fluorescent light. The next morning, I officially brought down the thunder. I walked into the downtown offices of Jonah Mercer, a ruthless real estate litigator I had worked with on a dozen corporate fraud cases. He did not ask me how I felt. He asked me for the evidence directory. I handed him the encrypted drive. Within 2 hours, Jonah was dispatching aggressive, legally binding data preservation demands across the city. He fired official spoliation letters to the secondary mortgage lender, legally commanding them to freeze and retain every single byte of data related to the fraudulent home equity application. He sent a formal demand to the building management office, explicitly ordering them to secure all server logs, forged registration forms, and digital communication records. He subpoenaed the county notary commission, demanding the official physical logbook belonging to Grant Price. He was locking down the battlefield, ensuring my family could not burn the paper trail before the judge saw it. The pressure was escalating to a breaking point, stretching tight like a piano wire ready to snap. I returned to my loft that evening, double-checking the heavy-duty smart lock before stepping inside. As I set my keys on the counter, my phone vibrated with a direct message notification. It was from the neighbor down the hall, the same woman who had cracked her door open with a camera during the morning assault. The message was brief. It simply said she had been reviewing her personal doorbell camera archives after the incident and thought I needed to see this immediately. Attached was a compressed video file. I tapped the screen to play it. The footage was grainy, shot in the low light of the hallway night mode. The timestamp in the lower corner read 2:11 in the morning. The date was exactly 3 weeks prior to the morning my mother showed up with the crowbar. The video showed the hallway outside my door. It was completely silent. Then, a figure stepped into the frame. It was Grant. He was wearing a dark jacket, moving with an eerie, practiced silence. He stepped up to my door, pulled a small white plastic keycard from his pocket, and pressed it against the electronic sensor pad above the handle. A tiny green light flashed on the sensor. The electronic locking mechanism engaged with a soft click. He did not open the door. He simply stood there in the dead of night, staring at the handle, verifying that his cloned keycard successfully bypassed my security. He smiled a tight, chilling smile in the darkness, turned around, and walked silently back down the hall. He had the key. He had the access. They had been standing right outside my bedroom while I slept, waiting for the perfect moment to break down the door and call it their own. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon via a brief text message from Valerie. She asked me to meet them for dinner, promising that we could just sit down and end this quietly. She claimed she did not want to escalate things any further and that the family simply wanted peace. I sat in the austere, glass-walled office of Jonah Mercer and showed him the glowing screen of my phone. Jonah leaned back in his heavy leather chair, steepling his fingers together. He advised me to accept the invitation, but he firmly insisted on accompanying me as my legal counsel. He warned me that I was not walking into a heartfelt reconciliation. I was walking into a room filled with thick, toxic smoke, and he needed to be there to ensure I did not suffocate on their desperate apologies. We met at a private dining room in a muted, overpriced Italian restaurant on the west side of town at 7 in the evening. The atmosphere in the small, dimly lit room was suffocatingly heavy. Valerie was already in the middle of a grand performance when we walked through the oak doors. She sat at the head of the long table, dramatically dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a white linen napkin. Grant sat beside her, rubbing his temples and heavily sighing, playing the role of the exhausted patriarch who just wanted his fractured family to be whole again. Across from them sat Sloane. She did not bother to pretend she was sad. She stared at me with pure, unadulterated venom, looking at me as if the impending collapse of her entirely fabricated life was my personal, malicious fault. I sat down. Jonah took the empty seat directly to my right, deliberately placing a slim black leather portfolio onto the center of the table. He did not order a drink. Neither did I. The waiter poured iced water and hastily retreated, clearly sensing the absolute zero temperature radiating from our end of the room. Valerie started the sermon almost immediately. She spoke in a low, trembling voice about how families should never involve lawyers, how blood was inherently thicker than property deeds, and how we all just needed to find a reasonable compromise. She suggested a quiet, sweeping arrangement. She proposed that I drop all of my aggressive data preservation demands and allow them to gracefully withdraw their title correction inquiries. In exchange, I simply had to grant Sloane a 12-month commercial lease at a highly discounted, family-friendly rate. I did not say a single word. I turned my head slightly and looked at Jonah. Jonah opened his leather portfolio, sliding a single, blank sheet of paper onto the polished wood. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with the terrifying, flat cadence of a surgeon preparing to make a fatal incision. He bypassed the emotional manipulation entirely and asked them directly where the initial financial contribution for the apartment had originated. He calmly demanded that they explain, on the official record, the exact source of the money Valerie had been loudly claiming to everyone in our extended social circle she had provided for my down payment. Valerie stiffened. Her trembling of fragile victim persona vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced by a rigid defensive hostility. She snapped that it was family money, fiercely guarding the lie. Jonah pressed harder, his tone completely devoid of empathy. He asked for the banking routing numbers, the specific withdrawal dates, and the tax filing records of this supposed monumental financial gift. Valerie slammed her open hand flat against the heavy oak table. The silver cutlery rattled sharply against the porcelain plates. In that split second, she lost complete control of her carefully curated narrative. Her face flushed a deep, ugly red, and she screamed that her mother had left that money for the survival of the whole family, not just for one selfish, ungrateful daughter to hoard for herself. The silence that followed her outburst was absolute and deafening. The truth hung in the stale air, ugly and completely undeniable. It was a confession violently dragged out into the harsh light. When my grandmother passed away 10 years ago, Valerie had acted as the sole executor of the estate. I had always been told there was nothing left but old furniture and a few sentimental trinkets. But Valerie had deliberately hidden a handwritten letter and a specific, high-yield municipal bond account that was legally designated entirely in my name. She had stolen my inheritance the moment the earth settled over the grave. She had buried the paperwork, kept the secret, and then spent the next decade slowly trying to figure out how to drain it, all while successfully convincing me that I owed her an unpayable debt for every single scrap of success I achieved. Grant did not look ashamed of his wife. He leaned forward, aggressively defending the historical theft. He stated bluntly that the money should have been liquidated and used to save their house from foreclosure years ago. He argued, with terrifying sincerity, that it was fundamentally wrong for hundreds of thousands of dollars to sit locked dead in a financial account, and later in a luxury loft, while the rest of the family was actively drowning in compounding debt. He truly believed my financial security was nothing more than a communal asset they simply had not yet been able to cash out. He looked at me with deep, bitter resentment, furious that I had unknowingly secured my own life raft while their ship was taking on water. That was the exact moment Sloane completely broke. The thin, glossy veneer of her polished internet persona shattered into a million jagged pieces. She leaped out of her chair and leaned forcefully across the table, her face contorted with raw, unfiltered panic. She screamed that she had already promised her new investors the loft. She shrieked that she had signed binding contracts and taken thousands of dollars in non-refundable deposits from commercial clients, all based entirely on the aesthetic background of my home. She wailed that if she lost this physical space, her brand would be permanently destroyed. She would be sued for massive corporate fraud, and every single layer of her supposed success would instantly evaporate. She demanded that I hand over the keys right then and there to save her from the devastating legal consequences of her own spectacular lies. I sat perfectly still in my chair, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their collective delusion. For the absolute first time in my 34 years of life, I saw the complete, horrifying architecture of the heist. It was a perfect toxic storm. It was my mother's boundless entitlement and historical theft. It was my father's crushing secret financial ruin. It was my sister's frantic, desperate panic to maintain a fake reputation. All of their massive, individual failures had intersected perfectly at one specific coordinate on the map. My name, my property. I was never a daughter or a sister to any of them. I was a designated casualty meant to absorb their impact. The air in the private dining room was thick with their heavy, frantic breathing. They had laid all their ugly, desperate demands on the table, waiting for me to finally break, waiting for the lifelong conditioning of family guilt to finally force my ultimate compliance. Jonah did not let them breathe another word. He reached into his portfolio one last time. He did not shout. His voice was colder than the melting ice in the untouched water glasses. He looked directly at my father. He stated that earlier that afternoon, a county judge had compelled the immediate production of the official notary public journal registered to Grant Price. Jonah leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, fixing his eyes mercilessly on my father's suddenly pale, sweating face. He announced that his investigative team had personally reviewed every single entry from the past 12 months. There was not a single line, not a single signature, and not a single fingerprint in that entire official ledger that matched the registration number stamped onto Sloane's forged residency application. I walked away from that private dining room expecting the crushing weight of exposure to finally break them. Jonah had surgically dismantled my father's forged notary ledger. In any rational universe, catching a man fabricating official state records would force a full, immediate retreat, but I fundamentally underestimated the terrifying velocity of their desperation. When you strip away the last remaining shred of a narcissist's plausible deniability, they do not apologize, they double down, they simply change the battlefield. They realized they could no longer win on the administrative front. The paper trail was too securely locked, the digital timestamps too rigid. So, less than 48 hours after that dinner, they abandoned the forgery angle and launched a direct, lethal strike against my personal sanity. The official notification arrived via a courier directly to my desk at Halcyon Title Resolution. It was an emergency civil petition filed in the county court. I broke the seal and scanned the heavily formatted legal text. My blood turned to absolute ice. They were no longer claiming a simple misunderstanding over a lease. They had submitted a sworn, signed affidavit, claiming I had made a binding verbal agreement to grant Sloane indefinite co-tenancy. But it was the justification for this supposed verbal contract that took my breath away. The petition explicitly stated that the family was stepping in because I was actively suffering from a severe, undocumented mental health crisis. They claimed that the grueling 18 months of field deployments in disaster zones had severely fractured my psychological stability. They painted a horrific, entirely fabricated picture of me as a paranoid, erratic woman who could no longer safely manage her own affairs or live alone. The affidavit stated that Sloane moving in was actually a desperate rescue mission, a family intervention I had tearfully begged for before my condition deteriorated into total hostility. It was the dirtiest, most spectacularly vicious hit they could have possibly designed. They were not just trying to steal my property anymore. They were actively attempting to execute my professional and personal credibility. In my line of work, analyzing multi-million-dollar risk portfolios requires an ironclad reputation for objective, rational judgment. If my own family successfully entered a public legal record claiming I was mentally compromised, it would not just lose me the apartment, it would instantly terminate my federal security clearances and destroy my entire career. If I sounded crazy, then my meticulously gathered evidence of their fraud would be dismissed as the obsessive, paranoid delusions of a sick woman. The fallout was immediate and suffocating. Because the civil petition invoked a tenant rights dispute paired with a wellness concern, the building management was legally paralyzed. Kevin from the management office called me, his voice tight with profound legal discomfort. He informed me that the building association was compelled by state housing regulations to schedule an expedited, internal administrative hearing regarding temporary access rights. If Sloane won this preliminary step, she would be granted a provisional, legally enforced right to enter and occupy my apartment while the broader civil lawsuit dragged its way through the sluggish county court system. That was their end game. If she got 1 foot inside my door with a judge's temporary blessing, getting her back out would take years and thousands of dollars I did not have. The walls of my life began to rapidly close in. Valerie did not just file the court documents. She aggressively weaponized her social network to build the narrative. She spent her days working the phones, calling every single aunt, uncle, cousin, and old family friend in her extensive contact list. She used her most heartbreaking, tearful voice. She told them all that her eldest daughter was deeply unwell. She spun a tragic tale of a mother desperately trying to monitor and protect a child who was losing her grip on reality. I felt the poisonous effects of her campaign 3 days later. I was standing in line at a local coffee shop, absolutely exhausted, waiting to order a black espresso. I felt a soft hand touch my shoulder. I turned around to find Mrs. Gable, a woman who had attended my mother's church for 20 years. She looked at me with a cloying, deeply offensive expression of exaggerated pity. She tilted her head, lowering her voice to a theatrical whisper that half the cafe could hear. She told me she had spoken to my mother. She said she was praying for my mental recovery. She actually reached out, trying to squeeze my arm, and told me that pushing my loving sister away during a psychiatric breakdown was a mistake I would deeply regret. Every single muscle in my body seized. The urge to scream, to drag her out to the sidewalk and forcefully explain the forged notary stamps and the fake property liens, was violently overwhelming. I wanted to tear my mother's narrative to shreds right there in the middle of the coffee shop, but I looked at Mrs. Gable's sympathetic, completely brainwashed eyes, and a cold, brutal realization washed over me. Valerie had already won the social war. There was absolutely no amount of logic, no stack of documents, and no rational explanation that could instantly undo a weeping mother's lie. If I reacted with the anger I genuinely felt, I would only visually confirm their exact story. I would look exactly like the unstable, aggressive woman Valerie claimed I was. I stepped back, completely removing my arm from her grasp. I did not smile. I did not defend myself. I simply told her to have a pleasant morning, turned my back, collected my coffee, and walked out into the freezing wind. It was an incredibly painful choice, severing my fundamental human need to be understood by my community. I had to let them all believe I was broken. I had to let my mother play the martyr. I intentionally locked away my pride and poured every single ounce of my remaining life force directly into the counter-offensive file. Social vindication meant absolutely nothing if I lost the roof over my head. I needed a legal slaughter, not a public apology. Behind the scenes, my chosen allies were operating with terrifying efficiency. Dahlia Knox bypassed the standard bureaucratic delays at the county recorder's office. She leveraged every professional favor she had accumulated over a decade in the title industry to pull a fully certified, deeply authenticated chain of title for my parcel. She secured the hard copies, heavily stamped with the official state seals, proving unequivocally that no other human being had ever possessed a fractional claim to the deed. Meanwhile, Jonah Mercer was ruthlessly cornering the secondary mortgage lender. He successfully legally compelled the bank's fraud department to release the exact internal digital timestamps of the home equity application. The data log proved the loan was initiated from my father's commercial garage internet protocol address, precisely at a time when my work badge scans proved I was physically locked inside the Halcyon Title Secure server room across town. It was an airtight, indisputable alibi against their financial forgery. Downstairs in my building, Kevin, despite his hands being tied by the upcoming administrative hearing, did the one critical thing I needed. He quietly archived the raw, unedited master file of the security camera footage from the morning they attacked my door. He preserved the high-definition video of my mother wielding the heavy steel crowbar and my father clutching the cloned access card, ensuring the digital file could not be mysteriously corrupted or automatically deleted by the server's 30-day overwrite protocol. We were building an impenetrable fortress of hard data, while my family continued to happily construct their castle of emotional lies. I was sitting at my kitchen island at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night, reviewing Jonah's hearing strategy, when the heavy intercom buzzer on my wall suddenly screamed. I walked over and pressed the audio button. The nighttime security guard's voice crackled through the cheap speaker. He sounded highly apologetic. He told me there was a legal process server standing in the lobby, legally demanding access to my floor to serve official court documents. I told the guard to send him up. I already knew the administrative hearing was scheduled. I assumed it was simply the formal notice of the exact date and time. I opened my front door. A tired-looking man in a cheap windbreaker handed me a thick yellow envelope, asked me to confirm my first and last name, and walked quickly back toward the elevator. I closed the door, slid the heavy deadbolt shut, and tore the top off the envelope. I pulled out a heavy stack of heavily stapled legal paper. It was not the notice for the building association hearing. It was a brand new, aggressively escalated civil claim. Grant had officially filed a massive lawsuit for the immediate reimbursement of $55,000. The deeply fabricated itemized list claimed extensive costs for structural renovations, emergency plumbing labor, and general family contracting services. But the final paragraph was the true, lethal poison. The lawsuit formally petitioned the county court to place an immediate, encumbering mechanics lien directly against the title of my apartment until the fabricated debt was paid in full. They were legally attaching their fake numbers to my real asset. It was a calculated, devastating move to completely freeze my property, rendering it entirely unsellable and untransferable while they battered down my doors. The siege was no longer just outside in the hallway. It had officially wrapped its heavy chains completely around the foundation of my home. The text message arrived on my phone exactly at 6 p.m. on the night before the administrative hearing. It was from Valerie. The tone of the message was abruptly different from the aggressive, frantic social media campaign she had been waging for weeks. She named a high-end, dimly lit cocktail lounge located in the lobby of a boutique hotel downtown. She promised me that if I simply came to meet them, if I was finally ready to be reasonable and behave like a proper daughter, the family would immediately withdraw all civil petitions and mechanic liens. She swore we could just keep everything private and settle this quietly without a judge. I forwarded the location directly to Jonah Mercer. I did not ask for his permission. I simply informed him of the venue. Jonah immediately replied that he was picking me up in 20 minutes. When my family chose that hotel lounge, they were banking on a specific psychological dynamic. They wanted a private, intimate ambush. They wanted to surround me with disappointed sighs, tearful eyes, and the suffocating heavy weight of lifelong familial guilt. They fully expected me to walk into that room alone, emotionally exhausted, and ready to surrender my keys just to make the nightmare stop. They did not expect a seasoned corporate litigator to walk in right beside me. We found them sitting in a semicircular leather booth, tucked into the darkest corner of the lounge. The ambient noise of clinking martini glasses and soft jazz music masked the sheer tension radiating from their table. Valerie had dressed down, wearing a simple cardigan, explicitly playing the role of the heartbroken, weary mother. Grant sat stiffly, nursing a bourbon. Sloane was aggressively tapping her manicured nails against the glass table, her eyes darting nervously toward the entrance. When Jonah slid into the leather booth directly next to me, placing his sleek black briefcase onto the table, the psychological advantage they thought they possessed instantly evaporated. Valerie's jaw tightened. Her carefully rehearsed tears dried up before they even had a chance to form. Grant sat up straighter, his posture shifting from paternal disappointment to cornered hostility. My father did not waste time pretending this was a loving reconciliation. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out 2 sheets of cheap, standard printer paper. He slid the stapled pages across the smooth glass table toward me. It was a typed, unnotarized settlement agreement. I looked down at the words. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of their demands was printed in plain black ink. The contract stipulated that Sloane would be granted immediate, unrestricted commercial usage of the eastern half of my loft to operate her content studio. It demanded that Valerie receive permanent, unrestricted access to my secondary bedroom for designated family storage. Finally, it outlined a strict, non-negotiable monthly payment plan where I would directly reimburse Grant for the $55,000 of entirely fabricated family investment costs he claimed to have spent on my property. If I signed this piece of paper, they would magnanimously drop the lawsuit claiming I was mentally unstable. They were holding my professional sanity hostage for a permanent lease and a massive cash payout. I did not touch the paper. I simply stared at it. The heavy silence stretched on too long for Sloane. Her polished, aesthetic internet persona completely fractured under the weight of the quiet rejection. She leaned forcefully across the glass table, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure, unfiltered panic. She completely lost her cover. She shrieked, keeping her voice just low enough to avoid alerting the bartender that she absolutely needed the keys by tomorrow morning. She confessed that weeks ago, she had already sneaked into my building behind a delivery driver. She had hired a professional photography crew to shoot her entire luxury branding campaign right in the main architectural corridors of my floor. She had built her entire grand launch, accepted massive financial deposits from high-paying clients, and promised her remaining skeptical investors a grand opening based entirely on the aesthetic of my specific loft. If she did not have legal access to the apartment by tomorrow, her clients would sue her for commercial fraud, and her carefully constructed empire of lies would publicly detonate. Jonah ignored her entirely. He reached out with 2 fingers and pulled the typed agreement toward him. He adjusted his silver-framed glasses and looked directly at my father. Jonah's voice was the complete opposite of Sloane's frantic yelling. It was smooth, clinical, and completely lethal. He asked Grant a very simple, logistical question. He asked how my father could legally, or even logically, demand financial reimbursement for installing heavy-duty commercial deadbolts and structural subflooring on dates that occurred 3 full weeks before the property title was ever legally transferred into my name. Grant's face flushed a violent, dark red. The inescapable logic of the question cornered him instantly. His temper, frayed by weeks of secret financial ruin and impending foreclosure on his own home, finally snapped its heavy leash. He slammed his open palm down onto the glass table. The bourbon in his glass splashed over the rim. He leaned forward, his eyes blazing with absolute, undeniable entitlement, and snarled right into my face. He yelled that the dates on the invoices did not matter. He yelled that it did not matter whose name was on the closing documents, because it was always going to be their place anyway. The entire booth froze. The low jazz music playing from the ceiling speakers seemed to completely drop out of my hearing. It was the confession I had been waiting for, yet hearing it spoken aloud felt like a physical knife twisting in my ribs. It was no longer a desperate argument about a temporary favor. It was not a misunderstanding about shared family resources. My father had just explicitly admitted that my apartment was never viewed as my personal achievement. Before I even signed the final mortgage papers, before I even packed my first moving box, they had already collectively decided to take it from me. They had looked at my years of grueling, exhausting labor in disaster zones and simply seen a convenient down payment for their own salvation. Valerie gasped sharply, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. She realized instantly what her husband had just done. She frantically tried to do immediate damage control, stammering that Grant was just exhausted, that he was using a poor figure of speech, that his words were being twisted by my aggressive lawyer. Jonah did not let her finish her sentence. He calmly snapped his black briefcase shut. He did not raise his voice, but the absolute authority in his tone silenced her immediately. He informed them, speaking as if he were reading a weather report, that there would be no settlement signed tonight. He calmly stated that by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning at the administrative hearing, he was officially executing sweeping legal subpoenas. He promised to force the immediate production of Grant's physical notary journals, the encrypted building access logs proving the nighttime keycard testing, the exact internet protocol data from the fraudulent mortgage application, and the certified financial tracing of the municipal bonds. I stood up from the leather booth. I looked down at the 3 people sitting across from me. 2 distinct, overwhelming emotions crashed into each other inside my chest. The first was a profound, hollow agony. It was the agonizing, final death of any lingering hope I possessed. I knew, with absolute certainty in that moment, that my family had never viewed me as a human being to be loved, protected, or celebrated. I was simply a resource to be harvested, a piece of machinery designed to keep their sinking ship afloat. But wrapping tightly around that grief was a glacial, absolute coldness. The emotional mourning period was officially over. The final battle had arrived, and I was entirely ready to burn their illusions to the ground. I turned my back on them and walked out of the hotel lounge. I stepped out into the freezing night air, took a deep breath of the city smog, and felt truly awake for the first time in months. I did not sleep a single minute that night. I sat on my sofa in the dark, watching the headlights of cars passing over the distant river bridge. At exactly 4:48 in the morning, my cell phone screen illuminated the dark living room. It was an encrypted email notification from Dahlia Knox. I opened the message. Dahlia had spent her entire evening calling in extreme favors at the county probate archives, digging deep into the sealed, historical records of my grandmother's estate closure. Attached to the email was a high-resolution digital scan of a very old, yellowed piece of paper. It was the original, handwritten letter from my grandmother. I zoomed in on the cursive handwriting. The text was devastatingly clear. My grandmother had explicitly instructed the estate lawyers to place the municipal bonds into a highly restricted account solely under my name. But it was her reasoning that provided the ultimate weapon. She wrote that she was intentionally hiding this money from Valerie because she knew her daughter's reckless financial entitlement would eventually destroy the family. She wrote that this money was meant to ensure I had a safe place to live that no one in the family could ever take from me. It was the final, lethal piece of ammunition. The letter completely obliterated Valerie's decade-long lie about generously providing the family money for my down payment. As the sun began to rise over the industrial warehouses, I printed the letter, slid it into my pristine legal file, and prepared to take my life back. The emergency injunction hearing convened at exactly 9 in the morning inside a sterile, windowless arbitration room at the county courthouse. The air conditioning hummed a low, mechanical drone, a fitting soundtrack for the clinical dismantling of a family. The building management's legal representative sat near the back, waiting for the presiding magistrate to issue a definitive ruling on the temporary access rights. My family arrived 10 minutes early, perfectly dressed for the roles they intended to play. Valerie wore a soft, pastel cardigan, her makeup applied to make her look pale, exhausted, and deeply maternally concerned. Grant carried a thick manila folder clutched against his chest, wearing a rumpled suit and the heavy, burdened expression of a father who had been pushed to his absolute breaking point by an unstable child. Sloane sat between them, her head bowed, producing a single, perfectly timed tear every few minutes. They were fully prepared to flood the room with emotion, hoping the heavy tide of family drama would completely wash away the rigid structure of logic and law. They did not understand that my lawyer, Jonah Mercer, did not deal in emotions. He dealt exclusively in timelines. When the magistrate called the session to order and asked for opening statements regarding the civil petition for temporary residency, Jonah did not even look at my parents. He stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked over to the presentation monitor. He did not tell a sad story. He displayed a highly organized, color-coded spreadsheet. Jonah began with the absolute origin of the capital. He projected my halcyon title payroll records, highlighting the extensive hazard pay bonuses earned during 18 months of disaster zone deployments. He showed the exact wire transfer records from my personal bank account directly to the escrow company. He displayed the final recorded deed. Then, he overlaid their actions onto that same timeline. He showed the magistrate the exact date my father purchased the commercial lock hardware, which was 3 full weeks before my closing date. He showed the timestamp of the forged secondary residency application, filed at exactly 5:41 in the morning on the day they attacked my door. He showed the date the fraudulent home equity line of credit was initiated from Grant's commercial garage. The magistrate, a stern woman with sharp eyes, stopped taking notes and stared intently at the screen. The suffocating cloud of Valerie's maternal concern began to instantly evaporate under the harsh, blinding light of hard data, to solidify the financial perimeter. Jonah called his first expert witness. Dahlia Knox walked into the arbitration room radiating absolute professional authority. Acting as an independent title examiner, she legally swore under oath that there were 0 co-owners listed on the property, 0 recorded family contributions, and that the recent correction of interest requests submitted by my family had been officially flagged by her firm as a highly abnormal, unauthorized inquiry. She testified that the entire structure of their financial claim was an aggressive fiction. Valerie let out a soft, theatrical gasp, covering her mouth with her hands, as if she were deeply wounded by these terrible lies. Jonah ignored her performance entirely and called the building manager to the stand. Kevin did not speak much. He simply submitted a certified, encrypted flash drive directly to the magistrate. The screen flickered, and the nighttime security footage from the hallway began to play. The entire room watched in absolute silence as the digital timestamp read 2:11 in the morning. They watched my father creep up to my door in the dead of night and successfully test a cloned, unauthorized access card. Immediately following that clip, the morning video played. It clearly showed Valerie aggressively wielding a heavy steel crowbar and Sloane standing impatiently with a box of commercial moving labels. Jonah paused the video right on my mother's furious face. He turned to the magistrate and stated that people executing a welfare check on a mentally unstable relative do not bring industrial prying tools and moving boxes at 6:12 in the morning. He stated they were not there to talk, and they were not there to help. They were there to execute a premeditated hostile takeover. The dominoes began to fall with brutal, rapid precision. A sworn affidavit from the secondary mortgage lender was submitted into the official record, legally confirming that an unauthorized attempt to pull a massive equity loan had been stopped. The document explicitly named Sloane's limited liability company as the sole intended beneficiary of the stolen funds. Next, a certified letter from the State Notary Commission was placed onto the magistrate's desk, officially verifying that the registration number stamped on the forged residency application did not correspond to any valid entry in Grant Price's physical logbook. The Price family's side of the table fell completely, horrifyingly silent. Sloane stopped crying. Her face turned a sickly shade of white. Grant's hands began to shake violently where they rested on his manila folder. They were completely boxed in, surrounded on all sides by their own documented felonies. But Jonah was not finished. He saved the absolute kill shot for the very end. He pulled a clear plastic evidence sleeve from his briefcase and gently laid it on the projector. It was the yellowed, handwritten letter from my grandmother. He read the final paragraph aloud, his voice echoing off the sterile walls. He read the exact words my grandmother had written decades ago, specifying that the municipal bonds were entirely mine, hidden specifically from Valerie to ensure I would have a place that no one in this family could ever take away from me. Valerie physically collapsed. She slumped forward onto the wooden table, burying her face in her arms, letting out a genuine, ugly sob. The grand, decade-long illusion of her maternal sacrifice had been publicly, surgically removed, leaving nothing behind but the cold reality of her theft. Cornered, humiliated, and watching the walls completely close in, Grant lost the last shred of his composure. He stood up, knocking his chair backward. He pointed a trembling finger at me and screamed that it was not fair. He completely forgot the magistrate was sitting right in front of him. In his blind, desperate rage, he loudly confessed that the bank was taking his house in less than 45 days due to a massive tax debt. He screamed that they were going to be homeless, that they needed the loft for shelter, and that they needed the equity cash to survive while I selfishly sat on a gold mine. He had just explicitly admitted their motive on the official legal record. He confessed that the civil petition regarding my mental health, the $55,000 reimbursement claim, and the temporary access demands were nothing more than fabricated extortion tools designed to steal my property to pay off his secret debts. The magistrate slammed her wooden gavel down so hard it echoed like a gunshot. The ruling was swift, merciless, and absolute. The magistrate legally dismissed the civil petition in its entirety with extreme prejudice. She formally denied any temporary or permanent access rights to the loft. She completely invalidated the fraudulent mechanic's lien and the reimbursement demands. Furthermore, she announced that she was legally obligated to forward the forged notary documents, the fraudulent loan application, and the sworn confession of attempted asset theft directly to the district attorney's office for immediate criminal investigation. Kevin from building management did not even wait to leave the courthouse. He immediately drafted a permanent, legally binding trespass notice, officially banning Valerie, Grant, and Sloane from ever setting foot within 1,000 feet of the property. They left the courthouse separately. They did not look at me. They did not say a word. The heavy, toxic chain that had bound me to them for 34 years had finally, permanently shattered. That evening, I returned to my neighborhood. The sun was setting over the river, casting a warm golden light against the exposed red brick of the warehouse building. I rode the elevator up in total silence. I walked down the hallway and stood in front of my heavy wooden door. I pulled out my phone and accessed the smart lock administrative application. I permanently deleted every single old emergency contact. I wiped the entire digital history clean. I typed in a brand new, highly complex, numeric code. I pressed my finger against the keypad. The heavy steel deadbolt slid home with a loud, satisfying, metallic click. It was no longer the sound of frantic self-defense. It was not the sound of a woman locking herself away from a threat. It was the crisp, undeniable sound of a life that finally, completely, and legally stood on its own name. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can interact and share our thoughts together. Please remember to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me even more by pressing the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people around the world.